Thank you so much, Antonio, for joining me today. I really appreciate your time.
No worries.
So today I just want to, first of all, this is an old-time book of mine. And I know you've written 2 books. This is the first book, Asking Questions the Sandler Way. Would you mind telling us about this and also the second book that came out?
Sure. Well, that first book, it seems like ages ago that I wrote it now. If you've ever written a book, Solomon, I don't know, but it takes a long time from, when you first come up with the problems that you're solving for, which I'll talk about in a moment. Why did I write the book? And then working through that, putting it together, putting the synopsis together and all the chat. It just feels like a lifetime ago.
I know.
Then it takes about probably a year in editing and production, and then suddenly you see it on the shelves and you can hardly remember writing it, right? So we have 38 or 39 books now, and it's one of our top selling books, and it has been for the last 3 years or so. So it's one of our most popular books, I'm pleased to say, and for some reason it seems to have really sparked, people's imaginations, and it seems to be working at all levels, whether you're at sales or even customer services, sales management and leadership, because who doesn't need to get better at asking more strategic questions? So that's the first book. The second book, which came out, it was so interesting, which is called The 21st Century Ride Along.
Yes.
And it came out about 15 minutes before the world went into this pandemic lockdown.
Wow.
And so what people were very used to, sales managers particularly, going into the field with their salespeople in a field accompaniment or a ride along. Some people call them, windshield time, and going out and visiting customers with their salespeople. And then pandemic happened and no one was traveling anywhere. But actually, the timing was terrific, because what that allowed people to do is start doing things like this, Zoom
right.
and GoToMeeting, GoToTraining and Skype and all of that kind of stuff, which meant that managers could actually spend more time more quickly with their sales team out in the field, virtually.
Right.
So that's the second book. It's only been out for 3 or 4 months, whereas the other one's been out for 2 or 3 years. And again, it seems to be very, very well received. I'll probably write another one soon. We'll see.
Think you need to. You're on a roll here. How did you get introduced to Sandler? And also, just add on to that is, not only did you get introduced to it, you were so sold out that you even got your brother involved.
Right.
I want to know that story.
I was really fortunate. You can tell by the accent. I'm not local to Miami, but so I grew up most of my life in the UK, and I was really fortunate. More probably by luck than design, I ended up running what you would probably call a Fortune 60 company. So 4 Fortune 60 companies, like huge companies with huge numbers of people, billions in revenue. And I ran 4 of those. I mean, I worked my way up. I'm very old. I ran 4 of those for quite some time. And then I was offered a new job with an organization, an American organization based out of Dallas. And it was to run a third of the world for them. So it was Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and the Pacific Rim. I don't know. Big stuff. And the chairman said to me, hey, listen, just before you start, you need to get trained. And I said, trained in what? I don't think so. I've got a bunch of degrees and I've been trained in everything. And what could you possibly teach me? Save your money, said I. And he said, no, you don't understand that everyone in this organization gets trained by this organization. And I said, well, who are they? So he said, it's a company called Sandler Training. Never heard of them, I said. Right? So he said, well, you either get Sandler trained, because everybody in this business does, or you don't take the job. So I said, okay, so where's the training then? Their head office in the US is based in Dallas. And so I was really fortunate that my Sandler trainer, so I was a client, I became a client. Wow. My Sandler trainer was a chap called Tom Neeson, who's like one of our kind of like, every time you say the name, kind of the sun comes over the horizon and the angels start to sing. It's like one of the big names in our world. And so I was very fortunate that I had a terrific Sandler trainer. I was there in Dallas for a couple of weeks. And after day 2, I was smitten. I was like a convert. I'm like, this stuff is terrific, unlike anything else I'd ever learned. So I then went back to the UK and was heavily involved in bringing Sandler into the business around the UK, Europe, Pacific Rim, and all of that kind of nonsense, and did that for a few years. And then my brother, Carlos, who I know that you know, he was working in Miami for one of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies called AstraZeneca. So he was living here. So every time I went to Dallas for a board meeting, I'd swing by Miami and see, you know, my brother and my niece and nephew and all that nonsense. And anyway, one day, one drunken night, sat by his swimming pool in Miami, we decided that we would start our own business. We would do our own thing together, because he'd only ever worked for a big company, and so had I. And our father had brought us up with kind of this mantra going on in our head forever and ever and ever since we were a child about owning your own business. And he said, because he worked for an enormous company and I worked for an enormous company, and my father always used to say to us, it's better to be the head of a mouse than the tail of a lion. And so we always knew that, you know, we were going to start our business one day. So anyway, we had too much gin and tonic and we decided that we were going to do it, but we didn't know what company. One thing led to another, and we said, you know what, let's open Sandler Miami. And that was about 7 or 8 years ago. And we've been in business now for 6 or 7 years and hugely successful. We're one of the fastest growing offices in the history of the company. And we've been really lucky. We've got some great clients. And that's how a chap with a Spanish name, because my father was Spanish, my mother was Greek, living in the UK, ended up in Miami. That was a long answer, right?
No,
Sorry.
That's quite the story. And I got to tell you, I had read a lot of this. And I think to summarize the book, it summarizes what Sandler is all about, right? It's all about asking questions. So maybe you can, for anyone who hasn't picked it up yet, just a brief synopsis of what the book entails and how to ask good questions. Anything you could share would be fantastic.
Sure. I mean, so whoever can hear my voice, right, if you're listening to this episode, just take a second and think about this. And I'll ask you the same question, Solomon. So you tell me what you think. And, you know, I'm a nice chap and you're a nice chap. So let's just see where this question ends up. So what percentage of the time, Solomon, do you think that our, you know, on average, that our prospects, suspects, clients, what percentage of the time do they tell us the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? What do you think?
Well, it's definitely not 100%.
No?
That's for sure. It's going to be a high percentage because the more they like you, the more they're willing to share.
Sure. And I think you're right. So with clients that know and trust and like you, that you built a relationship with over time, then they're going to move towards that 100%. But what about brand new people, suspects that don't know you and prospects that have just met you? What do you think?
Exactly. I'd say you'd be lucky if you get at least 50% of information.
Right. So it's not 100%. We're south of 100%. So that's a challenge. They're not telling us the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And if they did, wouldn't our life be easier?
Yeah.
So I was thinking about that. That was one of the issues I was thinking about. And I was talking to an FBI. Have you ever been arrested by the feds?
No, I did not. I'm not.
That's the vibe. But the FBI are pretty good at getting to the truth, right? Fairness, you know, in fairness. And I was talking to them about how do they do that? And then they were talking to me about the difference between an interview and an interrogation and how they manage an interrogation and how they manage an interview. And it's not quite like you see on TV, right? You know, when the police they've got some guys interviewing or interrogating someone and everyone else is behind that two-way mirror, one-way, whatever.
Right.
And they're shining an angle poised lamp in somebody's face. And it seems when you see on telly, they're just asking them questions off the top of their head. But actually, in reality, if you ever do get arrested by the FBI, they're really thoughtful about the kinds of questions that they ask you. And all these questions are prepared in advance. They don't just invent them off the top of the head. And now you're kind of seeing the difference between an amateur salesperson and a professional salesperson, right?
Right.
So I then tied those two things together. I then thought about, so I'm fairly visual. My first degree was in architecture and I like to draw and map things out. And I was thinking about what an interaction with a buyer or a prospect looks like. And doesn't matter what industry you're in, doesn't matter what products and services you have. But if you think about it, what I'm about to describe is what everybody experiences. And so I was thinking about that principle of the truth, right? That was an issue I was thinking about. And then I was also thinking about that. So, well, first of all, how do we get to the truth? Well, we don't just light a candle and say a prayer and hope that they tell us the truth, right? We've got to figure out how to get to it. And that's by asking really, really good questions. And I'll give you some examples in a moment if you'd like.
Yep.
So we've got a truth issue, right? A truth issue, or getting to the truth issue. Then we have an issue of, let's say, time, because most buyers who are busy people, if they had a Harry Potter magic wand and they could decide how much time they're going to spend with you, the seller, typically they're going to say a small amount of time as possible. But the seller wants as much time as possible, right? So the buyer may say 20 minutes that he would like to give or she would like to give, and the seller would like 60 minutes, for example. So we're not on the same page in terms of time. And then if you think about it, we have limited real estate. Because let's imagine I'm going to meet with a seller for 60 minutes. How many questions can you ask in 60 minutes? You can't ask 400.
No.
Right? Okay, you can only ask a limited number of questions. And so if you've only got limited real estate, then the questions you ask had better be really rather good, right? And it occurred to me that the questions you ask really determine whether or not the time is well spent from both parties, right? And it could be a real point of differential because, Solomon, if I look and smell and sound and taste and behave and feel like all of my competitors, how am I going to get treated? Like that.
Just like them.
Which means that the only way that they're going to differentiate between me and them is price. And that's never good, right?
No.
So I have to differentiate myself in some way other than price. And it occurred to me that the intelligence of the questions would be one way. The other issue that we have then is that the seller wants the buyer to do all of the talking. Right? Tell me what your issues are, how long you've had them, who you're talking to, what have you tried, did that work? So the seller wants the buyer to do all the talking, but the buyer wants the seller to do all the talking. They want to show up and throw up, and they want to say, okay, show me what you've got, and do lots of what we call free consultancy, right? Yep. And at Sandler, we have a rule which is 70-30, which we want the seller to be talking only 30% of the time. We want the buyer to be talking 70% of the time. Well, what's the mechanism that you use to control the airtime? The right questions, right? So we have a truth, a time, a talking issue, and then we've got this strategy issue where the buyer wants to interrogate, the seller wants to interview. So we've got some disconnect there. The seller's typically a bit more aggressive or assertive, and the seller doesn't have equal business status. So they're subservient to the buyer, and questions fix that. The seller wants to be thought of as a trusted advisor, and the buyer wants to treat us like a vendor, and questions fix that. And then the seller, at the end, the seller wants to just get to a decision. Just give me a decision at the end of this meeting. But the buyer wants to give us a very firm, let me think it over. And questions fix that. So it occurred to me that all of the issues, which are kind of time, trust, truth, talking, strategy, style, outcome, right? All of those things are controlled by really, really, really good questions. And that's why I wrote the book. Another long answer. There was a good question, but a long answer. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, no, and I think you hit the nail on the head there because of the fact that you have limited time, to do this, and you want to look different from all the people that they're going to be interviewing. As a sales rep, you got to do some planning. Can you speak a little bit about planning before you show up? And
so we all, we talk about it in this book, in most of our books, and certainly the other book, the 21st Century Ride-Along book that we were talking about, that, we need a pre-call plan because that's the only way that you improve. So you have a pre-call plan, then you do the event, and then you review it, and then you see, and that's how you grow and develop. And wisdom comes from evaluated experience. And so we need to think about, in terms of our pre-call plan, we need to plan what our upfront contract's going to be. We need to plan what questions we're going to ask, just like the FBI, right? We need to make sure that with this limited real estate, we're asking really, really, really good questions. So can I demo a terrible question and a great question?
Let's do it.
Just so that you see the difference, right?
I absolutely would love that.
All right. So imagine I was going to meet with the CEO of a company. I don't know, a roofing company. I only say that because I went and saw a roof. So if I'm going to go in and interview the CEO of a roofing company, we've already established I've got a limited amount of time and limited real estate, and so I've only got a few questions to ask. And I probably, on average, we're talking maybe 10 questions. So I've got 10 questions to ask, which means that I want every question to be absolutely a work of art, right? Because it's one of the ways that we differentiate ourselves. It's how we control the talking and all of that stuff that we talked about earlier. So if I said to the CEO, let's imagine he's called Solomon, just for the sake of it.
Yes, so let's do it.
So we're going to do a little bit of bonding and rapport, and we'll talk about the weather and the price of fish. And then I'm going to say to him, so Solomon, tell me, I remember, let's pretend this is the first time we've ever met. And I said, so Solomon, tell me, how long have you been the CEO of this company, right? So if you think about it, that's one of my 10. It's one of my 10 questions gone. And you might think, oh, that's a good question because that's good for bonding and rapport. And I'm going to say, that's a terrible question. So people think intuitively, oh, that's a nice, gentle question. We don't have time for gentle questions, right? So if I can find out how long you've been the CEO of the roofing company by using LinkedIn or your website or some literature or Google search, right, then that's a wasted question, right? Because I've only got this limited real estate. And guess what? All of my competitors have said, so Solomon, how long have you been the CEO around here, right? Or what markets do you work in? Or how many people work at the place? Or who's your biggest customer, right? Really, really rubbish question. Like if we were watching Gladiator, I don't know whether it's video as well, right? But see someone putting his thumb down and someone would be getting the head cut off. So a much better question, I think, would be if I said to you, so Solomon, why don't you take a couple of minutes for me and describe for me what you're seeing in the marketplace right now that is maybe going to have the most detrimental impact on your competitive positioning and maybe threaten your competitive advantage over the next couple of years. And then just look at you and don't blink. The first question is, how long have you been the CEO around here? The guy thinks, okay, you're just like everybody else. The second question, they think, man, that's a good question. And when they say, man, that's a good question, do I go up in their estimation or down in their estimation?
Open, yeah, exactly.
You go up in their estimation. So you build trust. You build credibility, you build status, you build largesse and goodwill, and you build all of that stuff by the questions you ask. And your value as a salesperson, or your value as a sales manager, or a coach, or a trainer, or whatever you do, is more measured by the information you gather than the information you give. So what I want everybody that's listening to this to do is think about what are the 10 really, really, really smart questions that you could ask in a typical interview, and learn them like the FBI do. Write them down, craft them, make them beautiful. The other thing, just as a secondary point, so we've got to make sure that we're crafting really, really good questions. We talk about how to do that in the book, of course. The other thing is that nearly every person I have ever trained, we all get the same 20 objections or pinch points or friction or speed bumps. Almost the same 20 issues, just in a slightly different pair of pants day in, day out, right? So we also need to think about, start writing down all of the objections you get, or all of the hassles, or all of the questions you get. And then sit down in front of a computer and craft, beautifully organize the right answer to that question. Right? So when you get a question, first of all, you're not allowed to answer it unless you know the motive behind the question. Once you then figured out the motive behind that question, that's the question you answer, and that better be a good answer to their question. So the thing about questioning, it's not only questions you ask, it's questions you don't ask. It's questions to find out the motive behind their questions, and then it's the answers you give to their questions. So asking questions the Sandler way, right, available in all good bookstores and Amazon, right, deals with all of that.
I love that. And that leads me to my next question, which is rule number 12. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, thank you. It's interesting because when you sent me that thing about today and you said, what's your favorite question? What's your favorite Sandler rule? And I wrote down rule 15 for some whatever reason. But you're right, it is rule number 12. So rule number 12 is answer every question with a question. What that talks to is when somebody asks you a question. So somebody said to me, for example, hey, Antonio, how many offices does Sandler have? That's a very innocuous question. It's a very casual throwaway question. And it's a very easy question to answer. And I want to say, oh, I know that one, right? Ask me. And I want to say 275, whatever the number is. Well, when someone asks me a question and says, hey, Antonio, how many offices have Sandler got? And I say 275, what have I learned? Nothing. What has he learned? Well, he's learned 275, but he actually might not have learned anything that's useful. Because he might I might say 275 because it strokes my ego and it makes us feel terrific. But he might think when I say 275, I'm going to be a very small fish in a very big pond. These probably aren't the people for me. Right. So I've said 275. I've told the truth because that was the question. And I told the truth. And now he's thinking, these aren't the people for me. And I think I've done a good thing by saying 275 and I've actually done a bad thing. Or he might think, I just wanted some small bespoke something. These guys aren't going to be bothered with me. Or conversely, or he could be thinking, God, these guys are going to be expensive. Or he could be thinking to himself, oh, terrific, because I've got a guy in New York and I've got a guy in California and I need to train them both. So that's the perfect answer. My point is that when somebody says to me, hey, Antonio, how many officers has Sandler got? There is a reason that he's asking that question. And if I say 275, I learn nothing, he learns nothing useful, and we all end up going nowhere. However, if somebody says, how many officers has Sandler got? And I go, man, that's a great question, Solomon. You want to know how many officers we've got? Of all the questions you could have asked me right now, why is that important? And if he then says, well, because I've got a guy in New York and I've got a guy in California, that's the question I answer. Now I'm going to answer that question. But if he says to me, well, it's because I'm just a small guy in Miami, and if you guys are Coca-Cola size, you're not going to be interested in me, right? Now that's the question I answer. So even the most innocuous question that they ask us has at its heart a motive. And we should never answer any question until we know the motive. Well, how do we know the motive? By asking a question when they ask a question of me. So when they say, how many officers have you got? Or how long have you been going? Or how many members of staff have you got? Or what other clients have you got? I need to figure out what's going on. And chapter 10 in the book, we call that a reverse. When we answer a question with a question, that's called a reverse. We're reversing the flow of information. There are 18 standard reverses, chapter 10, that talks about, so man, that's a great question. Of all the questions you could have asked me, why is that one important right now? That's one of those reverses, and we have 18 of those.
Wow, that's deep. I cannot tell you. That is absolutely fantastic. Well, I wanted to leave us with one quick thought that I think every single person that's like a sales manager, leader, CEO that might be listening, I speak a lot about importance versus urgent tasks every single day. And, we all fall into that trap of, well, it's urgent, so I got to go stop what I'm doing and then go do that. And then tomorrow you wish you didn't do that and something else important. And in your leadership training, you teach so many people, coaches, CEOs, everyone, how to manage their time so that they can get ahead. Like we always say, how do you get out of the trap of urgent and move into?
That's a great question, and I won't reverse it, right? But yeah, so it's interesting because because we coach people, and then we also have a coach, right?
That's awesome.
How can we coach people if we don't have a coach ourselves? But my coach says, and I don't want to offend anybody if anybody's listening and they run, like a training company that gives, time management training or something, right? I don't want to upset you, but my coach says, hey, listen, you can't manage anything that you can't control. You can't control time. So there's no such thing as time management, right? It's because we all get 24 hours a day. Days, the minutes tick and the seconds tick, and we all get the same. So there's no such thing as time management, but there is something called behavior management, right? You can decide what you do. So many of our leaders and managers and CEOs, they tell me a version of, I'm too busy mopping up the floor to turn off the tap, right? I'm just too busy doing stuff. Like I haven't got time for that because I'm running around dealing with all of these fires. I've got fires over here and a fire over there, and I'm constantly firefighting, and I'm running around like crazy doing this urgent thing and that urgent thing and the other urgent thing. And that used to be my life when I was running companies as well. I was constantly putting out fires. And the coach I had then used to say, why don't you go and have a look in the mirror, Antonio, and you'll see the arsonist looking back at you, right? I was always putting out fires, the fires that I wasn't managing properly so that they weren't being stopped by other people. And so we spend our time in the high urgency, high importance box, where everything we're doing is super urgent, super important, and that means we're not managing the business well, right? We've got to look in the mirror and say, just let me pump the brakes for a second. If I am behaving like this, it's entirely my own fault, right? So what I need to do is high importance, low urgency. So I can work on the business instead of in the business. I can learn to delegate properly and all of that kind of stuff. One of the ways to think about it is at the end of every day, kind of take a moment and think about, have I been task focused today or have I been people focused today? Task focused means you're running around. People focused means you're developing people, you're coaching people, you're improving their skills so that you'll be able to delegate to them better, and you will build a stronger team. And half the time when you're putting out fires, you're putting out other people's fires, and that's your fault too.
Yeah.
So if you find yourself in the high urgent, high importance, high task, low people orientation, get yourself a coach, right? Get yourself sorted out. So the number one leadership mantra is, it's my fault. And these things are your fault, right? If they're not you, then who? So we coach our leaders and our managers how to manage their behaviors better, how to develop their people better, how to run their businesses better. And when you do all of those things, you find yourself in the high importance, low urgency.
No, that's brilliant. And like I said, it's either you manage your day or the day is going to manage you.
Exactly.
Right?
No, exactly right. Yeah. And it's you decide, because everything is a decision, right? And if you're super stressed, it's because you've decided to be. If you're super disorganized, because you've decided to be. If you're super panicking, it's because you've decided to be.
Yeah, not only are you a trainer, Antonio, you're also a therapist too, I'm sure.
We all are, right?
To your clients. So
thank
you. Thank you for this session. You can send me the bill. I'll go ahead and pay for it. But thanks for joining me today. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to grabbing the second book. I got this one, the ride along. It's going to be my next one. And hopefully we'll interview for the next book that you're going to write.
100%. Let's do it.
Thank you so much for joining me. See ya.
All right.